All right, so this is the review for the new Western Hemisphere test over the Americas. So again, just like every other test, I'm going to go over the main ideas that you need to know for the test. I recommend you watch this video a few times if you want to make an A or a B overall. And again, I also recommend you take notes as I go through this. Look at the notes you have taken from class. Compare it that way. Just whatever you can. If you just sit and listen to it, it won't sink in as much as if you actually actively write and take notes or highlight things in your notes as we go through it. All right, so first off, looking at the interaction between Europeans and Native Americans when the Europeans arrived here during exploration, like with Christopher Columbus and right after that. So that interaction, of course, brought about a lot of diseases. So there's diseases like smallpox, which Native Americans didn't have any immunity to, and so whenever the Europeans showed up, about 80 to 90% of the population was killed by smallpox because of that interaction. And then we talked quite a bit about NAFTA. So with NAFTA, it's North American Free Trade Agreement, and that is what opened up trade barriers between us, Canada, and Mexico. And the goal was to increase production, to make it cheaper, also help the Mexican economy get better as well, to improve. And so a lot of manufacturing moved down towards Mexico. And so that helped things become cheaper, products especially like automobiles and stuff like that. We also mentioned how President Trump is working on a new deal called USMCA. That deal is not technically law yet. We're waiting on Canada to ratify that. And so as of now, anything on the test will be in reference to NAFTA. And then Panama. So Panama is where, of course, the canal is, Panama Canal, that connects the Caribbean to the Pacific Oceans. So that way we don't have to go around South America anymore. And Panama has grown significantly because of that, especially if you look at the city of Panama. It's gone from just a little port town to a major business center because of the money they make from the canal. And so if you were to look at that just comparatively, all that growth that's happened there, economically, it's because of the canal solely. Like just one boat going through the canal costs just over $400,000 that they have to pay to Panama, and that's every boat. And so you can imagine how much money they're getting from that. So they've improved quite a bit in their infrastructure due to that. All right, and then the term Latin America, you should know first off where Latin America is. So it's everything south of the United States. So that's, of course, Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, South America. Also keep in mind where North America ends and where South America begins. So North America is everything that's not South America. So Central America is part of North America, Mexico is part of North America, the Caribbean is part of North America. The only thing that's South America is South America. Also, culturally, some things you're going to see in common throughout most of Latin America. You're going to see Spanish throughout a large region because the Spanish conquered most of Latin America. You'll see Portuguese in Brazil because it was the Portuguese that conquered Brazil. And the main religion, they're majority Christian, and most go to the Roman Catholic Church because, again, Catholicism, Spain is mainly a Catholic country, and so, of course, they bring that with them over to Latin America. So it's that influence from those that colonized them. Same thing even in Brazil, they're mainly Roman Catholic because Portugal is also a majority Catholic country. All right, and then the Columbian Exchange, you should know what that is. So the Columbian Exchange is all the products and goods and stuff like that that were transferred and exchanged between the Americas, Africa, and Europe after exploration. So I say after, but like along with that. And of course, Columbus's voyage is what started all that. So once he came over here, and then they realized like this is a new world, and it brought about this exchange of goods between the different areas. And of course, there's going to be population pyramids. Make sure you know how to read a population pyramid, just basic interpretations of those. There'll be some readings that you do, answer some questions on little, what's called vignettes, like little short readings. All right, and then going back to the factories along with NAFTA. So remember the factories that are along the Mexico border. Those are maquiladoras. And the maquiladoras, they mainly employ Mexicans. And a lot of them are on the southern side of the border, just on the just south of the U.S. border. But of course, that can also take jobs away from factories that are inland in the United States, like in Ohio or something like that. A factory may close there because they can open up a maquiladora on the border, and you pay people less there, a little bit cheaper than it would be to pay people in Ohio, and so therefore production is cheaper. So then, like any economic solution is going to have a negative impact on someone. There's no economic idea you can come up with and implement where there's not someone that gets hurt. Someone's going to lose jobs. You know, people like Factories are going to get closed, but they're going to open up somewhere else. And it's better overall for the economy, but you do have to sacrifice some jobs in order to improve the economy for everyone. All right, and then the trading partner for Canada, biggest trading partner, of course, is the United States, because we're right next to each other. Most of their population lives right next to the U.S. border. And so that's just, like I said in class, like you would borrow and exchange things more so with your neighbor that lives right next to you than you do with your neighbor that lives 3 blocks away from you. It just has to do with how close we are, and we're all connected. So a lot of these I've already answered in the stuff I've been explaining. So, all right, then looking at democracy, and this is one thing I mentioned in class, is looking at, why is it that Latin America, democracy didn't really take root there, become strong like it did in the United States and Canada, and it has to do with our history. So U.S. and Canada, of course, were British colonies. United States, we fought a revolution against the British and won. And we used the ideas from what is called the Enlightenment to fight that revolution. So the Enlightenment was this movement in Europe, mainly in France. Is like basically the idea of just questioning authority of the monarchy. Like, why is it the monarch is in charge and has all this power? Why do nobles have all the money and everything? Why are peasants just dirty, stinking peasants living in the countryside? Like, why can't we all be equal? Why can't we all have power? Why can't we all have a say in the government? And those questions are actually very dangerous questions. And they led to some bloody revolutions, the American Revolution being the first one. And then we saw the French Revolution in France, which is the bloodiest revolution in Western civilization. And so those ideas are very dangerous ideas if you're a monarch. And so in Spain had a very strong monarch. They had one of the strongest monarchies during that time period. And that monarch did not want the ideas of the Enlightenment moving from France into Spain, because if they get into Spain, it's going to compromise his power. The people are going to rise up against him and chop his head off. I mean, we see the king of France and the queen of France get their heads chopped off. If you're the king in Spain, you're not going to let those ideas get there if you can stop it. And so since he doesn't allow those ideas to get into Spain, then of course the ideas of the Enlightenment are not going to make it to Spanish colonies. Because you don't want a revolution in Spain. You definitely don't want a revolution in your colonies where people are being oppressed big time. And so those ideas of those Enlightenment ideas, the ideas of democracy and the ideas that we're all equal, of life, liberty, property, all of that never makes it to Latin America. So we have a revolution and we set up a democracy immediately because we're using those ideas that were basically born in France to make our country. Those ideas don't make it to Latin America. And that's why today they're struggling to work towards democracy, because they have a long history of being oppressed by leaders that have all the money and power and wealth and all that, and they just keep their people poor. And keep them oppressed, keep them less educated, so that way they don't learn enough to actually ask these questions and realize they deserve more and realize what democracy actually is. So that's a long answer, but the basic idea is that Enlightenment ideas, which created the idea of democracy and as we know it today, took root here in the United States and Canada because we learned about the Enlightenment. We had access to what they were doing in France. Latin America never got that because Spain kept those ideas from coming in. So that's when we talk about diffusion and spread of ideas, those ideas spread to us because they weren't blocked. They did not spread to Latin America because they were being blocked by the government in Spain. Basically, it's putting a wall up to ideas and not allowing those ideas to move. So that's why you see that huge difference between the two, still currently. All right, and then, of course, because of that, the governments in Latin America, they're dealing a lot with corruption. Corruption is the biggest thing they're dealing with, really, and then that's going to feed into everything else as far as the poverty they're facing and struggles with not enough jobs and lack of education and things like that. All right, then also remember your different levels of economic activity: primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary. So remember, primary is just getting raw materials like picking cotton. Secondary is adding value to it, so turning the cotton into a t-shirt in a factory. Tertiary is the service industry. That's where you want most people working. So remember, I mentioned that as an indicator of how strong a government is, an economy is. If most people are working at the tertiary level, then the economy is going to be a higher functioning economy, and people will be living better lives. So tertiary service industry, that's selling the t-shirt, or it's me as a teacher, it's a doctor, it's a lawyer, it's those kind of things. Then quaternary are the people that basically run all the systems, the highest paying level. All right, then representative democracy. So again, that's what we are. So that's where we elect representatives that are supposed to represent us in Congress and vote according to the way we feel on certain issues. All right, and as far as why the U.S. is the leading economic power today, we talked about that in class 2, and a lot really just has to do with naturally where we are. We already had tons of natural resources. We did nothing to get that. It was just here. And then our political system is stable, and so that allows business to do well here, because you're not going to invest in a country if things are unstable. You're going to invest only where there's stability. And then, of course, having a skilled labor force, having a good education system. In any country, if you're lacking one of those 3 things, you will not be economically powerful. All right, you need to know also some physical features we share with Canada. So the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains we both share with Canada. The Great Plains is where we do, of course, most of our farming. That's known as the wheat basket of planet Earth. So most of the wheat bread is made in our region all the way up into Canada. And then again, the Rockies go all the way into Canada, and that's where we do a lot of like mining and things like that. So remember push and pull factors. So remember push factors, things that encourage you to move away from a place. Pull factors are why you would move to that place. So push factor to move out of Mexico could be lack of jobs, lack of good education for your children. So then the pull factor is better jobs in the United States and better education for your kids. All right, then the correlation between physical features and where we live. So you're always going to see the highest density, the biggest populations are going to be in flat, fertile plains, because that's where we can grow crops that we can easily spread out and build on it and stuff like that. Mountains are really hard to build in. And so it's always the flat, fertile plains, usually around rivers, especially is where you see bigger cities, and of course on the coastlines. A little bit more reading. Also going to population, remember the correlation between, how well you're doing economically and what the population is going to be like. So in a country like the United States with a very good economy and people being highly educated, you're going to see lower birth rates because the infant mortality is not very high. It's expensive to have children. They don't, work on the fields to help make us money and stuff like that. And so we tend to have lower birth rates. So our population is either stable or shrinking if you don't count immigration. All right, and also economically, looking at the U.S., another shift we've seen since really the 1970s is a shift away from manufacturing. And so we've moved away from manufacturing because we're now in what's called a post-industrial economy, which means we don't really manufacture that much or more in the service industry. So we kind of moved on past that for the most part. So the areas where we had a lot of manufacturing, like Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, stuff like that, those cities have undergone a lot of struggles lately over the since 1970s, because they've lost a lot of jobs, a lot of manufacturing jobs to other places. And so we've seen the populations of those cities decrease quite a bit and poverty increase. All right, and similarities between us and Canada. So again, we're both British colonies. So we have a similar history. And then, of course, our population, we're a lot bigger than they are, a little over 10 times bigger. Economy, we both have strong economies. But a big difference would be is our power and prestige. We're the only superpower. So Canada is a powerful country, and they're definitely strong, but we're a superpower because economically, militarily, government, everything, we're the most powerful country on Earth. All right, and again, remember, we already mentioned this, but just tying in Latin America, why most people are Catholic and in most countries speak Spanish besides Brazil. It has to do with the Spanish influence, from Spain conquering the region and colonizing it. All right, and then looking at immigrants, keep in mind refugees. Refugees is different than just like a normal immigrant. So a normal immigrant can be moving here for any reason. They could just like the weather more and want to move here. But a refugee is someone that is fleeing something. So they're fleeing conditions in their country that are dangerous for their survival, where they are fearful for their lives, and so they are fleeing. So just keep in mind, especially when you're watching the news too, when you hear things like that, like a refugee is totally different than someone that's just wanting to move here because life would be a little bit better for them. All right, and then there'll be a question about the Zika virus. So you may not remember, but there was a Zika virus outbreak in Brazil back in 2016. And this came from mosquitoes and stuff like that. And it was a concern here in the U.S. because of our proximity to Brazil. And of course, we have a lot of people in the U.S. that are of Brazilian descent. And so there's a lot of movement back and forth between us and Brazil. So there's a fear of that disease spreading during that time period because, we also didn't understand it that well either. And then we also talked about the Sun Belt in the U.S. So the Sun Belt has received a lot of new people moving in from other parts of the United States. So Sun Belt, again, is the southern, kind of southeastern part of the U.S. From here, where we are, all the way over to like Florida, Georgia, up into the Carolinas, that kind of stuff. So a lot of people have moved down here because of air conditioning. Once air conditioning was invented, we saw a big movement down here because the weather is better in general than it is up north. And I even mentioned, too, how economically it's more productive in the South. We have more work days. Because of the weather being better. We have, we don't get as much snow and ice. All right, we also talked about pollution in the U.S. We do emit more carbon emissions per capita than anyone else in the world. We only make up 5% of the population, but we emit 26% of all the carbon gases into the air. So that's not something to want to be number one in by any means. All right, and then the Caribbean, we mentioned a little bit how the Caribbean has, there's different mixtures in the Caribbean than what you see in Latin America. So Latin America is mainly mestizo, which is native and Spanish blood, is the majority of the population. In the Caribbean, you get a bigger mix, because in the Caribbean, we also had the French involved in there, the British, the Dutch, the Spanish. They all colonized different parts of the Caribbean, and then also there was a lot of African slaves that were brought into the Caribbean as well. And then, so with that, you'll see that also with Brazil. A lot of, actually, Brazil received more slaves than any other country in the Americas. But anyways, that cultural mix is going to be a little bit different than what you see in the rest of Latin America. So, in the islands of the Caribbean, you'll see a lot of African influence, African cultural influence, along with Native American cultural influence. You'll also see European influence from different European countries, and it helps create, different dialects and different ways of speaking. Like in Jamaica, that was a British colony, but you have a lot of African influence. So the way they speak English is very different. Their dialect is very different because you have a lot of the African influence, and then you have the British influence as well. And it can make it hard to understand if you speak English in the United States. All right. All right, and then as I mentioned earlier, the biggest problem that Latin American countries right now are facing is corruption. Because really the corruption in their government and police force and stuff like that leads to all the other problems you're seeing. As far as, lack of education, poverty, and all that kind of stuff, it's because of corruption within the government. All right, then we're almost done. Going back to the rainforest in Latin America, we talked about slash and burn agriculture. So that's destroying a large part of the rainforest. And that's mainly natives that live there that are cutting down parts of the rainforest, burning it because that gets nutrients into the soil and then using it to grow. We also talked about how the soil in the rainforest actually is not that fertile. So you can only use it for growing a crop for about 3 to 5 years, and then you deplete all the natural resources. I shouldn't say natural resources, all of the nutrients, there we go, that are in the soil pretty much get depleted, and then you have to cut down more rainforest and burn more to grow more crops. Also, the other problem is the rainforest doesn't grow back as easily because it rains so much. There's a lot of runoff. That soil cannot hold seeds or anything like that. They can't really sit there and take root because there's so much rain, and so that's a big problem. But that's also the issue I talked about in class, where you have the balance of needing to protect the environment, the rainforest, the animals, and things like that. But you also have a group of natives that still rely on the land for survival. They rely on the animals. They rely on the forest. And so there's that balance of making sure that their lives are sustainable, that they can maintain their lives, their populations by living off the land, but at the same time, it's not totally destroying the rainforest. And killing the animals and all that. So it's that balance between the two of respecting the environment, but also respecting the native peoples that still live and rely on the land in a way that we clearly don't. All right, and then hurricanes. So going back to the Caribbean real quick, that area relies a lot on tourism economically, a whole lot. And so when hurricanes hit that area, it can obviously disrupt tourism quite a bit and really cripple an economy over there. And so that's, that can be a big issue. Like Puerto Rico got hit by a huge hurricane. And so when they get hit, it's going to, it takes a while before they can rebound and start doing well economically again. All right, last thing, and then we're done. The melting pot theory in American society. So we talked about that, how It's the idea that when immigrants, especially when we look at early 1900s, late 1800s, the idea was that when immigrants moved to the United States, they assimilated very quickly into American culture. And so, for example, my family, a lot of my family came from Germany in the early 1900s. And when they got here, like my great-great-grandparents spoke fluent German. Their kids spoke German at home, but then after they moved here, they pretty quickly got to where, like they told my great-grandparents, like, stop speaking German, just speak English, and so you can fit in. And so it's very much pushed to kind of forget your roots, forget your previous culture, and assimilate into American culture. So they stopped speaking German and stuff like that. So by the time my family had been here for 2 generations, no one really spoke German anymore. And the things that our family did back in Germany, they weren't really doing here anymore that much. And so you see that kind of assimilation to American culture. So that's the idea of the melting pot. It's, like fondue. So you got take different types of cheeses and you throw them in together and they melt and they blend together. And now you can't pick them apart. And that's the idea. Today, a lot of geographers and social scientists would say that we're not much of a melting pot anymore. We're more of a salad bowl today because now all the immigrants move in. A lot of them keep their cultures and we all live together in the same areas, but we kind of retain our cultural identities. And so, it's just like in a salad, you can mix the salad up as much as you want, but the crouton's still a crouton, the tomato's still a tomato. They're going to live together, they'll see each other, they'll hang out, but they're not changing. And so we're seeing more of that today with immigrants moving into the U.S. All right, and that's it. I know that was a little long, but there were several explanations, like the parts where I was going a bit longer explaining something, I was actually helping you on more like 8 to 10 questions at one time instead of just one question. So don't freak out and think that some of those longer explanations were just one question. I was hitting big ideas that you'll see throughout the test. So again, watch this video a couple times, use your notes, look back, highlight over stuff to get it all done.